we are creating a $79 million long-term tornado recovery fund to help residents, businesses, and neighborhoods recover and rebuild. That includes funding for repairing tornado-damaged homes, supporting housing preservation and new housing construction, stabilizing neighborhoods, repairing sidewalks, removing hazardous trees, and assisting residents with temporary housing and other recovery needs. The legislation also provides dedicated funding for program delivery, oversight, and accountability to ensure these dollars are spent effectively and transparently. In addition, the fund creates a $31 million North St. Louis Neighborhood Plan implementation funds. These dollars will help implement neighborhood plans already adopted by the Planning Commission and shaped by residents themselves. Funding can support housing development, small businesses, neighborhood beautification, infrastructure improvements, parks, and key community services. And importantly, projects funded through this process must demonstrate community consultation and alignment with the adopted neighborhood plan. So you will be asked to affirm specific spending strategies by voting to approve a later resolution or resolutions. This bill also proposes $65 million in major infrastructure investments citywide. It creates a $30 million water infrastructure fund to support $700 million in critical water system improvements, which water intends to use as part of a financial plan to leverage revenue bonds and a state and federal loan program. Another $30 million will go to a public infrastructure plan to support safer streets and sidewalks and traffic calming, create ADA accessibility improvements, support our recreation centers, tree removal, and neighborhood infrastructure upgrades. These investments prioritize high-need areas and corridors with specific pedestrian safety concerns. We're also creating a $5 million vacancy reduction fund focused on tackling vacant and neglected properties citywide. This includes strengthening enforcement against absentee property owners, improving vacancy data systems, supporting access to legal support for neighborhood groups, and expanding pre-approved building plans to accelerate redevelopment. And finally, this proposal invests $55 million in downtown revitalization. Downtown is the economic engine of our city and region, and its success impacts every neighborhood. These funds will support major capital projects, safer and more walkable streets, riverfront improvements, retail and restaurant activation, and event attraction efforts that bring more residents and visitors to downtown. There are a few more things in this bill that I want to touch upon before we move on. As I think everybody in this room can see, these funds on their own are not enough to fully repair our water and street infrastructure, completely transform our downtown, or restore communities devastated by last year's tornado. That's why many of them will be used to leverage matching funds. The Water Division, for instance, will be seeking state and federal funds, as well as increased revenue from ratepayers to reach its funding goals and major capital improvement. The funds will also be set up to accept matching donations from corporate and philanthropic partners, which in the case of North St. Louis and Tornado Recovery Fund will be absolutely necessary to meet the extraordinary almost $2 billion need for reinvestment after the May 16 tornado. I also want to note that each of the funds outlined here will be moved into their own interest-bearing accounts, meaning that the funds will continue to gain interest as they are spent down, and any interest that is generated from within those funds will be spent within that fund group.
One of them is the rapid repair program, which we have been standing up, and this will fund about 1,000 to 1,200 additional home repairs to be added to the queue through our existing infrastructure, the construction management contractors, and growing rapid repair contractor pool. We will have to grow massively the contractor pool to support this work, but the timeline for implementation is that work will be taking place between when these dollars are passed, hopefully starting to be deployed in July, through a December overall timeline. As we look at infrastructure, we have many hazardous trees, limbs, stumps, and emergency demolitions that still are taking place in the tornado zone, as well as sidewalk repairs. Those contracts have already been put in place, and so this would be a deployment of additional dollars into what we know are FEMA ineligible specifically areas to support that work. So that work would start to deploy as soon as those funds are available. And my team is already right now building out the plans to deliver that operations within our existing contractor pool once that funding is approved. The third category here is affordable housing preservation. This is to repair and bring affordable housing units back online. We have many properties, whether it be CDC-owned properties or other properties with land use restriction agreements that are affordable housing that were damaged by the May 16th tornado, or other ones that just aren't online. As we look at the continued housing shortage for tornado respective victims, bringing some of those additional housing stock online critical toward our long-term recovery efforts. And so the plan would be to launch an application in Q3 to deploy through June 2027. We're still currently working through what exactly that may look like through different partners like the Affordable Housing Commission, St. Louis Development Corporation, as well as external partners, with the goal of deploying that by June of this, deploying that through June of 2027 of next year. The next bucket is tornado resident support for $5 million. That is, again, the next phase of resident supports for rental assistance, case management, nonprofit supports, and direct goods. Most of that work was funded through December of this year from the past allocations that you all have already approved as a board. So this would be us to start to fund the next phase of that work. A lot of that finalized planning would be happening throughout Q3 of 2026 with the goal of contracting by Q4 so those services are available by the time we move into January of next year. Some of those funds would move into immediate deployment where there are gaps, but the lion's share would be expected to mobilize in 2027. The program delivery and administrative costs are an estimate for about 2 years of staffing related costs, other contracts and support services to deliver the funded programs. So those would be over the fiscal year 27, fiscal year 28, that would be spent down and fund the full team. And then we have neighborhood plan implementation. That one was specifically, we recognize that while we've had neighborhood plans in development, we have not laid out the infrastructure for that work long-term and how those work will be deployed. And so what's in front of the board bill is a resolution to determine what the infrastructure and priorities are that will come back to the Board of Aldermen with a broader deployment plan, with the goal of that being passed by Q4 of 2026 and then rolling out implementation next year. That gives enough time for most of the neighborhood plans in North St. Louis that are under development to have a good sense of what the core priorities are and then building that plan out for implementation alongside St. Louis Development Corporation.
This money would immediately be available, accessible to leverage into debt service payment. We know that we have water mains that are aging. We plan to address a significant number of projects that we've identified, over 30 projects with this funding specifically targeting state revolving fund dollars and loans. We also know that the treatment plants are struggling with issues with the pumping units that we rely on, other infrastructure at the treatment facilities that is causing us to be inefficient with the use of some of our more expensive, chemicals that we use to treat the water. And so immediately we plan to address source water issues with an intake rehabilitation project, issues with a lime facility upgrade, and also those pumping units. So, again, these dollars will go back to the infrastructure that serves the entire city to supply drinking water every day. And it is quite important that we get a jump start on those projects. This funding will allow us to immediately start to address them.
Right now, it shares here on the slides that our 50/50 program is one of our big issues that we're dealing with. We currently have about 4,000 properties that are in backlog that we're working to bring up to speed. Part of our strategy includes actually converting that system from a 50/50 program to a block-by-block program that will actually assist the residents in actually getting their sidewalks taken care of in a more expedient manner. In addition to that, we have a pilot program that we're getting ready to launch that will help us work with you to identify the deficiencies in your streets and your sidewalks, and to give you an assessment. The last time we did an assessment here in the city was in 2012. So we really don't know what the condition of the city streets are, but we're working through that pilot to actually begin to provide that information for you. And we've got 2 of your colleagues that have already signed up for the pilot program, and we've already identified the vendor, and we'll be making plans to go ahead and get that underway here in the very near future. In addition to that, we've got about 30 streets on our internal street paving program. We inherited, I think it was 12 from last year. We have an additional 18 that we currently have in queue. So there's going to be a total of 30 streets that we're going to be working to resurface just internally here within the department. When you consider those projects, as well as the asset management project that we're looking at, which we feel is going to really streamline our ability to communicate with you as well as the residents, and that has a price tag that has yet to be determined. I can share with you that whatever it is, it's going to be shared across departments, but the idea or the strategy behind the asset management system is to make our delivery of services much more direct, much more convenient, much more transparent.
First, there's $15 million of funding for catalytic redevelopment projects, including stabilization and site control efforts around major vacant assets like the Railway Exchange building. The idea there is to address some of the most visible barriers to investment downtown and help position these properties for future redevelopment and follow-on investment. Second, there is $15 million of investment contemplated for the riverfront. That includes improving pedestrian access, public infrastructure, and connections between downtown and the riverfront so that it functions as a stronger public asset for the city. The proposal also includes $15 million of practical public infrastructure improvements throughout downtown, things like sidewalks, lighting, crossings, traffic calming, ADA, improvements, and other street-level investments that improve safety, walkability, and accessibility. And finally, there's $10 million of support for retail, restaurants, storefront activation, and events that help increase activity and foot traffic downtown. The overall goal is to create a downtown environment where people want to spend time, where people can support local businesses, and where we can have continued investment in our city's core. At a high level, these investments are intended to help strengthen downtown's long-term competitiveness, improve the quality of life, and create conditions that encourage additional private investment and economic activity. Thanks.
Vacant, abandoned, blighted properties have been a serious challenge for the city of St. Louis going back decades. The city has suffered steep population decline, leaving vast stretches of vacant buildings and lots where homes and businesses once thrived. We know that vacant properties have caused an annual loss of about $25 million in real estate tax revenue. In 2024 alone, the city devoted about $20 million in direct services to maintain vacant property. We know there's also about $16.3 million in outstanding fees and fines owed to the building division, and about $11.9 million in outstanding fees and fines owed to the forestry division. What this bill proposes with the currently proposed allocation amount is to fund city staff focused on vacancy, blight reduction, and recovering with the city's vacancy-related expenses. It also would go to support established nonprofit legal organizations to support private enforcement of vacancy and nuisance laws against absentee property owners. It would also propose supporting city vacancy data, infrastructure, and analysis, some of which we've got some groundwork that has been laid, but there's a significant amount of work, integration, streamlining, and frankly automating for accuracy and sufficiency across the different city departmental silos that still needs to be done. And then finally, it would support the expansion of a pre-approved plans library, which is something a number of other cities across the United States have done as a way to streamline development of vacant properties, make it more affordable to do so, cut through red tape.
The reality is that the Water Division's current financial condition is unstable. Revenues are barely covering operating expenses. There are no meaningful operating services, no rate stabilization reserves, and no debt service reserves. As things stand today, the Water Division is not in a strong position to access the bond market. A poor credit profile would result in higher interest rates, reducing the value of any borrowing and ultimately cost to the residents. Before we can successfully finance major infrastructure improvements, we must first make the Water Division financially solvent. For that reason, my office engaged our financial advisor, PFM, to review the Water Division's financial situation and evaluate how RAM's settlement funds could be used to strengthen its position. PFM's draft analysis recommended a direct cash infusion of $40 million into the Water Division. Importantly, this was not to be alone. That investment would allow the city to reduce projected water rate increases, build operating reserves to more than $23 million within 2 years, and establish approximately 90 days of operating cash on hand. While not ideal, it would significantly improve the Water Division's financial standing and strengthen its ability to secure affordable financing for future infrastructure projects.
It's written in there as potentially forgivable. Potentially forgivable. Can you speak about that specific language? Hi.
So, yeah, obviously the language in there, does put it out there as a loan. We would have access to $30 million immediately to use. Our plan is to leverage that for debt service, but we also have to be in a position where we can go acquire debt. And, as the comptroller spoke to earlier, acquiring that debt, whether it's on the private bond market or through the state revolving funds, does come with making sure that you're fiscally responsible to pay it back. I do feel like immediately the funds would be available to use for debt service, as is laid out there, but in 2036, it does have the Water Division paying that money back, either by that maturity date with zero interest, or it can be forgiven. Certainly as a public utility, as a municipally owned utility that serves the public and tries to keep rates affordable and low, I would hope that forgiveness would be there if we are financially not able to pay it back or struggling again with the concept of another increase to continue doing the CIP work, that we would be heavy into by that time period. So I don't know exactly the terms around that, but again, as a public utility, I would think that it would be weighed heavily, the forgiveness factor at that time.
Yeah, I appreciate what the comptroller talked about at the beginning during her comments. I don't think it should be a loan. I think it should just be direct investment into the Water Division, into water infrastructure. Potentially forgivable just means the ratepayers are going to have to shoulder it, which is all of us, the people who are paying for their water.
So the first question about the nature of the match, will you lay that out for me one more time?
Yeah, I mean, I think myself and Alderwoman Schweitzer asked about this of like, what does that match look like in maybe tighter language in the bill that those funds can be accessed into the match. But sure. What are you thinking when you think about, is it 3-to-1 match now? So
no, I want to dissuade you from the 3-to-1 match notion. That was a thing that I know our CEO, Ron Kitchens, said in the context of the press event when he was asked a question about the match.
So and 2-to-1 match?
What he was, I'm sorry?
Is it a 2-to-1 match?
So what he's committed to, and what we've committed to very clearly, is that the $55 million in the bill, we believe we can find and facilitate private sector match for that $55 million investment in downtown. Now, I think where he's talked about 3-to-1 and all that was the idea that, I'm sorry?
If you could let him answer on record, it's good to just get the on the record.
Sure. This is all uncertain, right? We have to go out and find private sector match that will bring this money in, and that's what we're committed to do.
How you envision that $30 million being used? I know that we've kind of been talking about a range of anywhere from 30 to 60 from last conversation. So if you could speak to kind of how that $30 million was leveraged, and if you feel like that helps you to sufficiently do what you need to do, especially with the other opportunities for the water department on the table.
Sure. No, there are funding options that are out there. I've mentioned the state revolving fund loans. That's federal money for water infrastructure, that we can access and get a subsidized interest rate. Our plan with the RAMS funds is to obtain state revolving fund loans as debt. They would purchase bonds. We would have access to those funds to do project work. We've done them before. Back in 2013, we did about $10 million worth of SRF loan that got 14 projects, built. 2 new pumps at the Chain of Rocks plant, several water main projects that were, installed, replaced water mains, a valve assessment that was done that went out and exercised all of our valves and did a condition assessment on them, found many of them, failing, in need of replacement. The level of debt that we're going for now with the $700 million CIP that we have will certainly put a stress on water rates. And water rates are number one, form of revenue that supports the operations, the capital work that will go on. What the $30 million in RAMS funds would allow us to do is immediately access, funds to leverage against those bonds. It would act as a reserve that would be coupled with the rates, coupled with, ongoing improvement of the rates to support the CIP. But we would pay down debt service in state revolving fund loans that we would acquire. Over $100 million worth of SRF loan is in our 10-year CIP, coupled with, a little over $200 million in traditional revenue bonds that we would go for when we were in a fiscally viable position to go after that debt. Again, all of this comes together as a strategic plan to utilize whatever funding sources we have available, but immediately this would bring funds in to support going after those SRF loans and debt service. The projects would be over 30 water main replacements that we've identified. We've applied for this to the state. We have to show that we have rates and show that we have a reserve, that we are lendable. And right now we do not have a reserve, even with the ARPA reallocations. Certainly we still owe money to the city for the franchise tax. We are upside down and have been for several years, not able to go after debt to do this work. And so now we have this strategic plan, this comprehensive, master plan that we're working on, this rate sufficiency study. The RAMS funding piece allows us to start going after that debt immediately rather than waiting until when our reserves are able to go after that debt later on, when our rates are able to go after that later on. And the rates are going to be a strain on the ratepayers. We understand that. We've built in an affordability rate that will have people who qualify paying less after all of the increases than they are today.
The Water Division is an incredibly valuable public asset. Not only is water the lifeblood of our city, but it's coursing through 1,300 miles of water mains, 2 treatment plants, 2 reservoirs, and 15,500 fire hydrants, all publicly owned and supported by the ratepayers of St. Louis City. As a public utility and an enterprise fund, it relies on rates for daily operations, maintenance, and capital improvements. But for the last 7 years, it has not had sufficient rates to keep up with the cost of operation, and that has meant deferred maintenance of our infrastructure as well as running the Water Division at a deficit. Add in a moratorium on water shutoffs for delinquent accounts as well as rising costs, and the result has been the complete depletion of the Water Division's contingency fund. Before an emergency reallocation of our American Rescue Plan Act funds earlier this year, the Water Division was going to run out of money before the year. But thanks to a emergency bill, a couple emergency bills that were carried by Alderman Schweitzer, we reallocated some American Rescue Plan Act money, and they were able to operate through the end of the fiscal year. But without additional help, they will not be able to get through the next year. While we raised rates 2 years ago, it was the first time rates had been raised in 15 years. We knew at the time that it would not be enough. With over $700 million of capital improvement needs, the Water Division engaged in a rate sufficiency study to determine the path to financial solvency. This study looked at the cost of running the division, the available sources of income, the need to rebuild the contingency fund, and the need to create a rate stabilization fund. And it determined that the solution is a combination of rate increases over the next several years, cash from the RAM settlement this year, and bonding and loans. Without the rate increases, bonding will not be possible. Without the RAM settlement funds, bonding will not be possible. It will take a combined approach to put the Water Division on the path to financial solvency, And it will take the courageous action of the Board of Aldermen to raise the rates to ensure that this public utility stays public and can continue to deliver safe, clean water to every resident and business in St. Louis for generations to come.
We're going to include that 3%, that is in the rate sufficiency study, in the study and the recommendation of the proposed rates, but we'll only address CPI-U adjustments in addition to that 3% that was assumed in years where there's a CPI-U that is above that threshold. And as the schedule of increases runs through after 2032, it reverts back to just the CPI-U adjustment that may be needed to keep up with the inflationary costs so that we're not coming back after years of deferred action to increase water rates, that we are keeping up with regular inflationary costs. And then lastly, we have the affordability rate that was introduced. This is a brand new rate, 50% subsidy on the current water rates that are paid. This will apply to residential customers only in the city of St. Louis, whether they're flat rate or on a meter. They will have a 50% subsidy applied if they are meeting the income eligibility, if they're meeting the age eligibility, and some of the other eligibility that we built in here. We're working to establish the criteria that are going to be income-based, age-based, and natural disaster victim-based. Obviously, we had the tornado, and that is something that we cannot fail to address with this. We do see a component where the affordability rate will apply to those impacted by the tornado who have received assistance through federal, state, local dollars for the tornado. We want to work with those customers as well to make sure that they have access to this program. It is a 50% subsidy. This is modeled after other programs, in other utilities, Ameren, Spire, MSD. We will have reciprocity as well. If you have been eligible for one of those programs, you'll be eligible for our rate. We, in fact, want to go one step beyond and maybe offer more assistance. Again, we're working with experts in the field, providers in the space to make sure that we can address these affordability concerns, which the EPA defines as 2.5% of household income. And this varies, obviously, across the city. We have, the highest income earners where that's a bigger number. We are under that number. But the lower income earners, the at-risk customers to losing water service, that's what we want to address with this rate. And we will have immediate eligibility for those who have applied for and received our temporary assistance program through the ARPA. So we, again, have dollars available, encourage people to apply for that. If you have received benefit through that program, $500 assistance towards your water bill, you'll be eligible for this affordability rate.
Going through the budget for the last 3 weeks to hear from every department. The first week of budget hearing, they did not come, so we sent a subpoena to all of the Board of Police Commissioners. We have not received email or any conversation or written conversation back from them. We do have the mayor, who's a police commissioner, here. Just a few minutes ago, the Budget Committee received about 700 plus pages of documentation from the Secretary of the Police Department on, I would assume, their budget. None of us had time to review it. It is very clear and evident that they knew about the subpoena, and instead of coming in front of the committee, they decided to present 700-something pages.
Yes, and Madam Mayor, I appreciate you being in front of us today. You are the only elected official elected by the people of this city on that Board of Police Commissioners. And so you're the only voice we have to bring actual issues the city is dealing with to that board for their consideration. So my first question for you is, in your experience with the board so far, have you been able to successfully bring up concerns of the people of St. Louis and have them addressed by this Board of Police Committee?
I have been able to bring up many concerns, but I do not feel like they have been adequately addressed by the Board of Police Commissioners. For example, by way of example, this morning, we had a commission meeting. It was called yesterday with exactly 24 hours notice. As mayor, I also serve on the Board of East Gateway, our metropolitan planning organization. That's an important role for the city's mayor to sit in on and play and participate in. Unfortunately, those were planned at the same time. And so that meeting this morning was to consider a contract to drones to be used by the police department. And we were given the contract yesterday at 3:48 p.m. So we did not have an adequate amount of time to review that contract, let alone weigh in on it, to consider it. I pointed out to my fellow commissioners that that was an absolute lack of transparency, a lack of good governance in a general sense. And while I was able to voice those considerations, the board elected to vote on that contract regardless.
And looking at the numbers, I've observed that since FY18, SLMPD has not spent their entire budget.
That's correct.
Year after year, they have a surplus. And in past years, that surplus would come back and go back into the city's funds. Do you know what's going to happen if they have a surplus this year?
That's right. As you know, by city charter and by ordinance, those two factors, they're legislated separately, but budget surpluses are divided equally into a capital fund and our reserve. And so they come back into the city for every single city department. Under the state-appointed police board, that it is subject to change. I'm not able to speak definitively on that right now, in particular because, as you well know, the city has filed a lawsuit related to the state takeover to overturn the state takeover in its entirety, but there are several points in that lawsuit, some of those considerations. So I'm not going to speak on that today. We have close to 70 pending cases against the police department right now. Many of those, I think almost all of them precede state takeover. And so many of those are somewhat in limbo in a way. That is a serious number of cases. I believe it's more than Kansas City. I believe it's more than anywhere else in the state. It's an enormous amount of cases. The exact number of judgments or payouts or even settlements, I don't have the exact figure, but I can tell you that it's considerable. Some of those have been are pending final adjustments and that sort of thing. Appeals is the word I was looking for, excuse me. And so I think there's probably not a definitive figure available, but there should be a close figure, and that's something that I can work with the board to get some clarity on from the Board of Police Commissioners.